In Deep Appalachia, a lake house window fogs without breath and spells your name in wet glass. 8 creepy and scary lake house stories you were never meant to hear. Tonight, Dread Scribe writes again. Before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe for more chilling stories. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. And if there's a story you'd like me to cover next, I'd love to hear it too. The first night at the lake house felt like stepping into another century. The air was cool and damp, smelling of wet leaves and old wood. I had come to Appalachia seeking quiet, a reprieve from the endless noise of city life. The lake itself stretched out like a sheet of black glass, perfectly still beneath a sky so crowded with stars it felt almost claustrophobic. As I stood on the rickety wooden deck, a faint breeze stirred the trees, and for a moment everything was silence. The kind of silence that doesn't comfort you, but presses in like a heavy weight. That's when I saw it. A dim golden glow beneath the surface of the lake, swaying gently back and forth like someone carrying a lantern deep below the waterline. At first I told myself it had to be something natural, maybe the distorted reflection of a star or the headlights of a distant car catching the waves. But the light didn't behave like a reflection. It moved independently, pacing slowly, deliberately, as if it had legs. My mind scrambled for explanations, clinging to science like a lifeline. I remembered reading about certain algae and microorganisms that produce cold light, a phenomenon called bioluminescence. Perhaps there was a bloom beneath the surface, I reasoned. Yet no matter how many scientific theories I conjured, a deeper part of me whispered an older, more primal truth. Lights don't walk. By morning, I convinced myself it had been exhaustion playing tricks on my vision. The lake was calm and gray, its surface unbroken, as innocent as a sleeping child. I explored the small town nearby, a cluster of weathered houses and a single general store that smelled of pine cleaner and stale coffee. When I mentioned the lake house, the cashier's face changed subtly, like a curtain falling. "You staying out there alone?" he asked casually, too casually. When I nodded, he leaned closer and said in a hushed tone, "If you see lights on the water, don't follow them." His words clung to me like a burr, even as I laughed them off. That evening, as the sun sank behind the jagged tree line, I sat on the deck with a notebook, determined to observe the lake objectively, like a scientist. The air was heavy with mist, curling low over the water. Hours passed. Just as my eyelids began to droop, the glow appeared again, faint at first, then brighter, hovering several feet beneath the surface. My breath caught. This time it wasn't alone. A second light flickered into existence, then a third, forming a slow, deliberate pattern, as if marking a path. The hairs on my arms rose. I leaned forward, straining to hear any sound. A splash, a ripple, anything to explain the movement. But the water remained perfectly smooth, eerily still, even as the lights drifted toward the shore. A chill slid down my spine. Lights could drift, yes, but this felt like pursuit. As the nearest glow reached the shallow water, barely 10 feet away, I realized the truth that shattered every comforting explanation I'd built. The light wasn't beneath the water at all. It was inside something that was rising toward the surface. I didn't scream. I stepped back until the old boards, pressed my calves, and the lake kept breathing, slow and deliberate, like an animal deciding whether to lunge. The glow rose through the water on an invisible tether, not disturbing even a ringlet, the way a secret moves through a crowd without a sound. Then it breached. No splash, no bubbles, only light. And I saw what held it. A ribbed glass jar, cellar-old, its metal collar corroded, the lantern's innards humming faintly like a beehive. It didn't drift like flotsam. It navigated, as if remembering a route. I told myself to think like a scientist, not a child at a ghost story. But the night had that paper-thin quality of a skin about to tear. Somewhere in the trees, a whip-poor-will called, and the sound skipped across the water like a thrown coin that refused to sink. I forced myself to catalog, Warm spectrum, closer to tungsten than LED. No heat shimmer, no burning odor, no halo on the surface. Just a clean circle cut from the dark like a coin minting itself. My chest tightened anyway. Fear doesn't respect wavelengths. It respects survival math, adding up silhouettes like overdue debts. The jar paused where lake met shore, then slid laterally, as if following chalk lines only it could see. The path it traced felt practiced, a pilgrimage walked and re-walked until footfalls wore thought into habit. I moved with it along the dock, every nailhead silver and cold under the moon, every board a rib and something too large to name. It nosed beneath the dock. Up close, the timbers smelled of tar and rain rot, a sweet wrongness that clung to the tongue. The jar drifted under the third plank, then the fourth, honoring the warning I'd mocked in daylight. At the fifth, it stopped and brightened. I crouched until my knees popped in the quiet. Below my fingers the glow pulsed, a lighthouse sending wordless Morse through the grain. The water around it stayed perfect glass, the moon's reflection, unbroken. Yet the board warmed beneath my palm as if light were heat after all. But what was it signaling to, if not me? Heat crept along the plank, traveling like a fuse. Wood remembers hands, my mind supplied, stitching the cashier's voice to a thought he never spoke. Memory presses into rails and floors the way. Fingerprints cling to glass. I pressed my palm flatter. The warmth ticked like a heartbeat. A picture rose. A woman standing where I stood. Winter boots braced, lamp held high, breath unraveling like torn silk in the cold. Another pulse answered beneath my skin, and for a blink I wasn't alone on that board. The lake exhaled, barely. Something was coordinating breath. I grabbed science like a rope. Thermoclines can trap gas. Methane seeps mimic foxfire. Stressed, quartz throws pale glows. Triboluminescence sings when bonds break. I mouthed these possibilities like prayer beads, each a rung on a ladder I hoped reached shore. The jar quickened. Honeyed light slid between the planks and painted my knuckles like bones under X-ray. Nails creaked. The dock felt less like a structure and more like a sealed mouth trying not to speak. But what it was holding back, I couldn't name, yet. The air sharpened, bright with tin and old rain. I stood, heart drumming like an engine running rich, and edged backward. The jar tracked perfectly below, keeping pace as if listening for heat or decision. The board under my heel flexed. A colder thread of air lifted the hair along my neck. I looked down. Light bled up through a hairline crack, thin as a vein beneath skin. The glow wasn't only in the water. It had moved into the wood, then into the posts, and then, spreading like dawn under a door, into the house itself, stopping directly beneath where I stood. Something clicked deep below, the way a lock agrees to turn. The lake went dark. Warmth bloomed under the floorboards behind me, traveling toward the door like footsteps I couldn't hear. The lantern was inside now, moving through the bones of the house, and whatever it had followed to reach me was rising through the boards at my feet. The lake house was supposed to be my sanctuary. After months of relentless deadlines and a relationship that had frayed to threads, I craved silence, so deep it would feel like medicine. When I first arrived, the air smelled of damp cedar and iron-rich water, a scent both cleansing and raw. The house stood alone at the edge of the lake, its walls weathered and gray, with wide windows that faced the still water like watchful eyes. I told myself those windows were simply a feature of rustic charm. But on the very first night, lying, awake in a bed that creaked like old bones, I felt it. A subtle, almost imperceptible pressure, as though the house itself was inhaling. At 3 a.m, I rose to close the curtains, but stopped halfway. The glass was fogged from the inside, moisture swirling into shapes I couldn't quite define. It looked almost like breath pressed against the pane, except I was alone. My pulse quickened. I wiped the fog with my sleeve, leaving streaks, and for a split second, I swore I saw a handprint appear just as mine disappeared. Not on my side, but the other. When I blinked, it was gone, and the window stared back blankly, reflecting only my pale, sleepless face. The next day, I rationalized it the way anyone would. Isolation can play tricks on perception. My brain, overstimulated for months, was simply adjusting to sensory deprivation. I even looked up a scientific term for it: pareidolia, the mind's tendency to create meaningful images from randomness. Faces in clouds, figures in shadows, patterns that aren't really there. It was comforting, like having a diagnosis for a strange illness. Science has always been my anchor. If I could name it, I could fight it. That evening, I decided to test myself. I sat in the living room with a notebook, the largest window framed by darkness, and stared until my eyes burned. At first, nothing happened, just the occasional ripple on the lake, silver and harmless beneath the moon. But slowly the fog returned, rising in whirls that reminded me of cigarette smoke. It began to gather in distinct lines, looping and curling, until the pattern sharpened into letters. My stomach dropped. The word was simple, the notebook slipping from my hands. I turned on every light in the house, forcing logic into my thoughts like oxygen into lungs. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe condensation pooled unevenly due to the glass's imperfections. A random accident that just happened to form a word my terrified mind recognized. But deep down, I knew it wasn't random. The letters had been too precise, too deliberate, like a signature scrawled in breath. Sleep was impossible after that. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the lake lapping softly against the shore. At some point near dawn, exhaustion won. When I finally opened my eyes, the room was dim, bathed in cold, pre-sunrise light. And there, in the window, beside my bed, was my reflection. Only it wasn't moving with me. Its lips were parted, whispering words I couldn't hear, as if the glass itself had found a voice. I didn't look away. The reflection's lips shaped syllables like smoke rings, whole for a heartbeat, then gone. I tried to match them, but the figure didn't mirror me. It moved a fraction ahead, anticipating my flinch and swallowed breath, as if rehearsing a script I hadn't read. I lifted my hand and touched the pane. The glass was cool yet faintly pliant, like skin after a fever. A tremor fluttered through it, not a vibration from trucks or wind, but something rhythmic, almost cardiac. Houses shouldn't have pulses, I told myself, yet the window seemed to breathe me in. Morning lent me courage the way fog lends edges to a shoreline. I brewed coffee strong enough to anchor a ship and sketched diagrams in my notebook, chasing mechanisms like threads. Condensation patterns could be guided by thermal gradients. Micro scratches might steer beads into lines. Piezoelectric stress could whisper through old panes when frames swelled. It felt soothing to diagram fear, to pin it like a moth I promised to release. Yet even in daylight, the windows seemed to inhale, a slow tidal breath that counted me in. I needed a test. With the sun high, I stood inches from the largest pane and breathed steadily, counting, then held my breath entirely. The fog kept forming, without me. I tapped, soft, then harder, then a pattern only I would know from childhood. 4 knocks, pause, 2. The glass answered with a single soft click, like a tongue against a tooth. Wood can settle, frames can pop, but the timing felt personal, like hearing your name pronounced perfectly by a stranger. What exactly was it trying to learn about me at dusk? I set bowls of steaming water beneath 3 windows to force condensation, then aimed a laser pointer through the room, hoping to catch deflections the eye might miss. The beam wavered, shivering as if ripples traveled through the pane from the outside in. That should have been impossible. The night was windless, and the lake lay still as poured ink. When letters emerged this time, they formed slower, careful, as stitches. Listen. The word remained even as other fog faded, like a voicemail saved from deletion. But what it wanted me to hear, it did not say. Infrasound can unsettle the body. Turbines and distant storms bend the inner barometer. I narrated that aloud to keep panic from writing its own script. Yet another sentence braided itself beneath. My breath each stroke forming from the inside of the glass outward, impossible as frost blooming in July. You are inside. The grammar was wrong and exactly right. I pressed my ear to the pane. Beneath the hiss of air, I heard layered tones, like whispers threaded with pine needles, arranged just below comprehension, the way a lullaby hides instructions. I stepped back. The house creaked, relief or warning, I couldn't tell. My reflection whispered faster, urgency skating across features I had worn for years. Then the living room window brightened as if lake light poured through the wall, and every pane answered. The glass cooled beneath my palm and pushed. They weren't letting me look out. They were practicing how to open. I tried the door, the latch held. In the glass, my mouth shaped two words: welcome back. Fog lay low over Blackwater Lake. A slow animal curled across the water, and I stepped onto the dock for air that tasted of iron and pine. The house behind me exhaled its old wood breath, but I didn't turn back. Nights had been strange, stranger than good sense allowed, and quiet felt safer when it wrapped the shoreline like a shawl. I stood with my hands on the splintered rail and listened to the kind of silence that grows a second heartbeat. Somewhere inside it, a single ripple ticked. Then I heard my name, clear as a bell, crossing the lake. It wasn't shouted. It was spoken in the voice I use when I am almost asleep, soft, coaxing. A pebble dropped into deep water. My first thought was a camper or a fisherman. My second was the acoustic trick I remembered from physics. Cool night air, letting sound skate along the surface. Sound over water can travel farther, cleaner, like a skater tracing a perfect oval on black ice. But the name came again. Same pitch, same vowel, and the timbre, impossibly, was mine. Locals at the general store had a legend ready before I even asked. The lake, they said, keeps the last sounds of the drowned the way wood keeps old heat. Echoes ride the fog and tug you toward the spot that claimed them. I smiled then, the way someone smiles at thunder when they pretend not to count. My mind offered safer tools: pareidolia, hypnagogia, infrasound from distant engines, a memory misfiring like a porch light. The sensible story is always the first blanket we pull at night. But what I didn't expect was how quickly the echo learned me. It did not just call my name. It tried on a childhood nickname no one uses here. It recited 7 digits I haven't spoken in years, a number that once opened a gate to a lab and a life I left. It hummed the 3 notes my mother used to summon us from the creek, thin as thread and wet with distance. Facts lined up like patient stones and then faltered. Gravity had the night, but so did something else. I crouched, palms on the wood, and felt a faint tremor running through the boards. Not wind, not water, but a pulse like a drum heard through a wall. The fog thickened into a corridor. My voice, from the lake, my almost voice, grew practical. Count to 7, it said without air. Step where the diagonal boards meet the iron ring. Look to the left piling and wait for the second ripple. The precision unsettled me more than any ghost story. Instructions are how disasters dress up as help. Still, I listened. The lake is a mirror when it chooses, and tonight it was a stage. I counted, almost without meaning to, and the timing matched. A ring spreading at 7, a faint knock under the 3rd board, a breath of colder air rising from the cracks between planks like a cellar door lifting an inch. How could a story I didn't believe keep finding my timing? I kept my eyes on the horizon, because the voice warned me not to look straight down. And yet, what waits for a name that finally answers itself? The lake answered back. The lake answered back in movement, not speech. A bulge rolling under the Sioux. Planks. A hush deepening as if the basin took a breath. My weight shifted before I chose to move, like tide sneaking into marrow. The voice, my voice, one heartbeat ahead, said now. I stepped to the join where diagonal boards met the iron ring. The wood thrummed a brass note through my soles, and the fog tightened, corridor-like, toward the black center pretending to be still. Physics volunteered a map. Temperature inversion corralling sound. A night siege pacing the shoreline. The mirror effect that lets a whisper ride farther than a shout. But the echo didn't thin with distance. It grew precise, focused, as if the lake had tuned itself to me. Another instruction arrived, tender as habit. Untie the skiff, keep the rope slack, do not look down. Advice wears helpful clothing when it hopes to lead you somewhere you wouldn't otherwise go. I remembered the lab I abandoned after an unforgivable oversight, the afterimage of alarms painting my ribs for months. Guilt is an undertow, steady, invisible, patient. Then came the 3-note summons my mother flung across the creek at dusk, perfectly hers. But what it didn't expect was suspicion flowering like frost. If the lake had learned my timings, maybe it had learned my stubbornness too. I loosened the knot anyway, hands shaking in a rhythm I tried to call courage. The skiff sighed free and drifted, rope gliding over wood like a measured breath. At 12 feet, the rope drew taut as if a gentle hand had taken it. Count 7, I counted. On 7, bubbles stitched a bright hem along the gunwale. Beneath, clicks ticked, evenly spaced like metronome marks. Not shrimp, not this far inland. Gas from silt perhaps, or stones talking under a standing wave. But the rhythm matched my breath again. Sampling, I thought. It was sampling me. Breath, hesitation, the small falters a detector loves. Still, the next instruction arrived. Place one foot, then the other. Hold the rail, hold your breath when I stop speaking. Curiosity is a fuse dressed as question. I put a foot in. Cold climbed my ankle like a sleeve tugged by fingers. The lake's hum broadened into harmony. Pillars of tone holding the fog like columns holding a ruined temple to sky. What are you? I asked the horizon, and the answer arrived as pressure more than sound. Syllables shaped by stone, timber, silt. Not a person, not mercy, old as the basin, a mouth that remembers. The rope lightened in my hands as if the skiff had decided to hover. I tested it with a stone, dropped down without looking. A ring spread, then repeated 20 yards out. Impossible, a rehearsal of gravity where nothing fell. Charm, echo, throat on the empty shore. My name walked across the water, closer than breath, wearing the tone that once opened locked doors in my chest. The skiff tilted toward the corridor of fog, bowing to an usher. The clicks paused. The harmony waited. The rope slackened like invitation. If I turned, which version would be on the dock? The one that stayed stubborn, or the one the lake had already taught to say yes? The fog held its breath, listening for my answer. The dock, behind the lake house, ended like a sentence someone was afraid to finish. 3 planks. Then the board slid beneath black water, vanishing into a seam the color of bruised glass. Neighbors, in that Appalachian way of making warnings sound like weather, told me never to step beyond the 3rd. I nodded, unloaded boxes, and told myself superstition doesn't pay rent. Measurements do. That first evening, I stood at the edge with a tape measure and cooling coffee. The wood smelled of creosote and rain rot. Every nailhead shone like a small coin. A heron folded itself into fog and pretended to be driftwood. 3 planks, I said under my breath, then set my heel on the 4th for a count of 5. The board gave an exhausted sigh and settled. Nothing reached for me. The lake lay quiet as a dark window, but the unfinished edge needled me like an eyelash in the eye. I framed it as professional curiosity. Growing up around labs and blueprints trains you to love the border between known and unknown. Psychologists call it reactance, the urge to push the line we're handed. Folklore says don't name a door if you won't walk through. Either way, the warning became a dare, and dares are just research and work boots. I began small. 1 step onto the 4th plank, knees bent, arms loose, the way a child tests ice in early winter. Light behaved like a liar near the sunken section, bending wrong, sinking too fast, pooling into gray that had depth without detail. It looked like those old photographs where faces blur, as if the subject refused to be recorded. I tossed a pebble. It vanished without a splash, like a coin slipped into a magician's sleeve. That should have been enough. But what I didn't expect was the feeling that followed. Not triumph, not relief. Permission. As if the lake watched me run its small gauntlet and moved the goalposts closer. On the third morning, fog arrived late and wind slept in. I laced my boots, slid my phone into my pocket, and walked the planks the way a diver recites numbers before a jump. 1, 2, 3. I set my heel on the fourth and felt the board hum, low and patient, like a cello warming a room. Count, breathe, observe, I told myself. A sinkhole can drink a shoreline if limestone and time agree. Pockets form, roofs collapse, water pretends to be floor until it decides to be throat. The air thinned with that iron smell storms leave behind. I took the fifth plank. The lake changed texture. What looked like water behaved like cloth, tugged from beneath by careful hands. Shapes rose, skeletal, jointed, too regular for waves, curling. Toward my boots as if remembering how to hold. I didn't run. I stepped back once, then froze because the board behind me wasn't where it had been a heartbeat ago. The dock felt longer than it looked, coded like a forgotten map whose roads appear only when traveled. The next tug came gentle, almost polite, the way a host touches your elbow. Foam traced wrists, weed thread articulated fingers. Beneath, wood answered with a knock. The surface dimpled into a ring, drawing itself into the first curve of a single letter. The curve kept tightening until the ring looked purposeful, a stroke placed by an unseen hand. Around it, the water knit into shadows, weed threads braided into finger bones. Blisters of foam cupped the air, rehearsing a grip. The fourth board bowed like a violin string. I felt its note in my knees. I prodded the seam with the broom handle and met resistance that wasn't wood, not quite water. Something with the patience of mud and the focus of a palm. What surprised me most was the gentleness. Each tug like etiquette taught by a patient teacher at the bottom of the lake. The surface thickened, then loosened, the way a sauce answers a whisk. Non-Newtonian, I thought. Children's science dressed for midnight. Yet this didn't just respond. It organized. A low exhale rose from the gap, mineral cold, salted with the tin of old nails. Karst can open its throat, I reminded myself. Cavities yawn, roofs fall, a shoreline learns to become an edge. Even so, the gap felt deliberate, like a throat studying my name. Somewhere beyond the trees, a dog barked once and stopped mid-note, snipped clean from the night. I needed data, not bravado. I tied a pebble to twine and let it drop. The line went slack too quickly, then tugged sideways, sketching a shallow ellipse. Currents can do that, so can a drain. But the ellipse tightened until the twine pressed hard against the plank, sawing a groove like a metronome carving time. The dock seemed longer than a minute ago. Perspective stretched thin as taffy. Optical tricks live at waterlines, my brain knows that. The lake had a counter-argument. The groove breathed a thread of smoke. Hands kept forming. Tendons of eelgrass looped into a wrist. A pale knuckle surfaced, bubbled, and held shape without breaking. The smell shifted to the sweetness of disturbed silt, the breath of cellars and old books. The letter on the water took a second curve. I stepped forward despite myself, not brave, not foolish, studious, which is both. If I took one more step, would the lake finish writing me? The board answered with a tiny laugh, a fiber snapping somewhere inside its spine, bright as a glass thread. I thought of the person I was before deadlines made a noise in my chest, the one who touched experiments softly and apologized to glass when it broke. If there was an arc for me, it was learning to stop proving and start listening. I set my weight diagonally, distributing load as if crossing a sleeping dog's ribs, and eased back. But the lake moved first. The plank behind me sighed and nudged. My heel, a host ushering me toward a door I hadn't seen. The letter's third stroke unfurled, ribbon clean, like a signature rehearsed for years. I let the twine go. The pebble vanished without complaint, and the groove it carved gave one last ghost of smoke, then cooled. Foam fingers loosened. The shapes withdrew until only ink-dark water remained, a word floating upon it, patient as a verdict. My breath fogged and drifted sideways, nudged by a draft rising from the seam. The letters gleamed, undeniable, below. The dock edged closer, like a listener leaning in. The ripple narrowed to a blade, pointing. If I answered, would it open for me, or close over me for good? Winter pinned the lake beneath hammered glass, and the house braced its timbers the way a body clenches its teeth. I came for quiet work, and cold, but the ice arrived with a personality. Restless, articulate, muttering along the shore like a neighbor who knows your secrets. By day, the surface went pale as bone. At night, it darkened to ink and gathered starlight into a bowl. The first morning I saw it, a shadow slid beneath the ice and kept its line. Too long for a fish, too coordinated for wind, it skimmed the weeds and paused under the unfinished reach of the dock, as if reading the boards. Even after it faded, the lake held a crease there, like a page a thumb had pressed and left warm. The cold made instruments of everything. Breath became chalk, lashes turned to thorns, and sound traveled too far. When the ice flexed, it sang low, wail, music for timber, and the notes walked the shoreline. I carried a notebook and worked like a surveyor of small mysteries. Refraction here, Fresnel glare there, albedo throwing my depth cues off like a joke. The mind loves an edge case the way a tongue worries a cracked tooth. Perception slips, then pretends it didn't. Each dusk the shadow returned, routine, pacing a loop that circled under the dock and stalled at the dark center. It felt less like a current and more like a habit. On the third day, I stepped onto the lake before dawn, when the cold felt cleanest. My boots tapped small notes over crusted snow, and I knelt to lay my palm flat, testing the skin of the world. Something moved below, steady, mammal slow, and the ice answered with a brittle sigh. Hypothermia, I told myself, can remix the senses. Cold pulls blood from fingers and feeds the inner theater. People dream with their eyes open when temperature erases edges. Still, the shadow slid beneath my hand and held there, elongating until it looked like a spine under glass. It struck me with a tenderness I didn't expect, a grief for things that live trapped, as if the lake were a museum and I had pressed my face to the wrong exhibit. By noon, the wind sharpened into a file. I walked the perimeter, mapping stress lines like a doctor tracing old scars. The ice held leaves like pressed moths, and bubbles mid-ascent like Morse code. Sometimes the lake fired a report through the valley, a crack splitting into echoes. I called them physics, yet my map of the Shadows Patrol began to resemble intention. It skirted the shallow cove, avoided a pocket of white rot, and kept to the blue-black pane like a pilgrim to a path. It was choosing, and choice wears a face even under ice. Curiosity is a fuse disguised as a question. On the fifth day, I dragged an auger onto the lake and set it where the shadow idled. The first turns were work. The second, music. Ice squealed and the sound climbed my bones. Shavings curled like translucent petals. I worked steady, counting so I wouldn't think. Halfway down, the resistance changed. The auger bit into something that wasn't water and held. I cleared the slush and leaned to the hole. Below, not moving, was a pale plane, and set within it, a darker circle the size of an eye. It didn't blink. Waiting. The wind combed the snow into cat's fur around the hole. I told myself I was seeing silt under a lens, a trick of angles. Eyes are circles fear completes. Still, the darker ring held so centered it felt deliberate, like a pupil painted on a mask. I tapped the edge with my knuckle. The ice replied with a thin bell. I needed proof, not drama. I slid a metal ruler through the hole until the cold nipped my wrist. The ruler met the pale plane and stopped as if touching glass. The lake wasn't frozen solid. Something beneath wore this lid like armor. I pressed harder. A tremor passed, through the surface, faint as a cat walking across a piano. The darker circle shifted left, then right. Movements that read as intent, but what it meant to measure was me. I backed an inch and felt winter settle deeper into my shoulders. A cloak, laid by a polite ghost. Hypothermia can preface itself with clarity, I reminded myself. I named every sensation. Numbness, grit, tin salt on the tongue. The shadow slid beneath the hole again, elongated now. A comma asking for the rest. The lake groaned to the east. A plank pulled through an old house. The house sat hushed on the shore as if everything here belonged to a single circuit. I threaded a length of line through the ruler's hole and lowered it, slow as a prayer. The line brushed the pale plane and skated along it as though over enamel. Then something below tapped back, 3 small knocks in a rhythm I knew from the creak of my bedroom floor. It borrowed my house's voice the way cold borrows color. That should have sent me running. Instead, I leaned closer. The hole threw a chill up my nostrils like mint. Beneath, snow motes and bubbles drifted like confetti. The darker ring dilated, then tightened again, a patient lens deciding focus. I whispered names of ice, candled, black, clear, rotten, like beads through fingers. A hairline crack traced from the hole toward my boot, delicate as a vein beneath skin. Another branched north. The sound that followed was intimate, a zipper drawn, and the lake's song deepened. I should have stepped back. But what I didn't expect was a sudden bloom of warmth, a thin wash along my shins, like standing near a radiator that wasn't there. Pressure rose under the lid. The cracks sprinted outward, white lightning written on glass, mapping the cove into panes. The shadow swelled beneath me, less shape than event, a darkness reorganizing into limb and hinge, rehearsing reach. The ruler lifted against my fingers as if someone below had returned it. I stood, legs wooden, breath counted and careful. The lake inhaled. A single decisive crack shot past the unfinished dock toward the house, a line scored straight as a ruler's edge. Air burped from the hole. The darker ring surged. A cold hand of water kissed my boot sole. Then the entire pane bowed as if nodding. Something below pushed up, testing the lock. And when the ice finally answered with a shudder, the shadow rose. Toward the surface, eye-opening, as if to see whose name it had learned. I held still, counted, and waited for its choice. The guestbook sat on the coffee table like a friendly relic, cloth-bound, corners softened by hands that had come for summer and left sunburned, smiling. When I opened it, the paper smelled faintly, of dust and lemon oil, and the first pages were a parade of gratitude. Sunsets like postcards, loons at dusk, perfect coffee on the deck. A child's drawing of the lake wobbled across one margin, blue crayon running like rain. After months of noise, it soothed to read proof that quiet could be borrowed. Each sentence felt warm as a porch light. As I flipped further back, the tone thinned, like a smile that can't hold. Exclamation points dropped away, handwriting tightened. Notes began to mention a tapping at night, a shape on the waterline, someone standing on the dock when no footprints followed. The phrase recurred with variations, like a chorus you can't forget, the one who never leaves. I wanted to laugh at the melodrama, but the phrase stuck under my ribs. Fear spreads like ivy, finding purchase in the smallest crack, then owning the wall by morning. I told myself the guestbook was a laboratory of suggestion, a petri dish where stories cultured overnight. Psychologists call it social proof. When a chorus says a room is haunted, the mind adjusts its thermostat of belief. Still, the house listened like old timber. The windows breathed a slow fog, and the dock made that careful, throat-clearing sound. What I didn't expect was how the writing began to shape the hours. After a page about creaking pipes, radiators ticked like beetles. After a sentence about distant humming, a low tone braided the silence. Near midnight, an entry staggered across, the page in hurried slant. If you hear the soft knocking, don't answer it the third time. The ink had bled as if the hand had been shaking. I checked the date and felt gravity tilt inside my chest. The line was dated tomorrow. Below it, a second sentence appeared to be forming, impressed without ink, as if the pen had moved, but the page refused the mark. I tilted the book to the lamplight. The indentations rose like fossils. They described the sweater I was wearing. I set the book down as if it had a pulse. The radiator's ticking seemed to step closer, then back, like someone rehearsing the hallway. My rational voice kept its job, filing possibilities, a prank, a misdated entry, a previous guest with my taste in knitwear. But under the filing cabinet, something softer moved. Recognition, the kind you deny because to name it is to grant it keys. Words are machines, I thought, little engines that turn rooms. And fear is an engineer. It can retrofit any house. I opened to the final pages to prove control. Blank at first, then not. Ghost letters rising as if breathed upon, a gray sentence coalescing from the paper's grain. The entry held tomorrow's date and, impossibly, my name. It described where I would stand when the knocking started, how I would reach for the lamp, how the bulb would fail like a tired star. Halfway down the page, a new line deepened. When you finish reading this, the first knock will come. The house inhaled. I closed the book. The sound arrived, gentle as a request. The first knock was courteous, knuckle to timber, like a neighbor practicing good manners. I froze with the book half open, the ribbon like a vein across the page. I reached for the lamp because the sentence said I would, and the bulb sputtered obediently, dimming to the color of old honey before failing. Darkness pooled in the corners, not empty but busy, like a workshop after hours. I told myself suggestion is a ventriloquist, and my fear its puppet. Then the second knock came, a little bolder, and the guestbook warmed under my palm as if it had been waiting for cue. Somewhere the radiator clicked twice, approving, softly. I didn't answer. Instead, I opened to the indented page and ran my thumb across the grooves, like reading Braille written by tomorrow. Social proof, I reminded myself, can herd the senses. Panic is contagious as yawned sleep. But what I didn't expect was how the room behaved like a witness. The curtains drew the cold closer. The floor held its breath between boards. The clock's tick seemed to tiptoe. In the margin, a fresh line lifted, colorless as frost. Right politely. I laughed, a thin noise a mouse might make, and felt ridiculous relief. If it wanted manners, maybe it wanted terms. I could negotiate, with written air. Perhaps. I found a pen that wrote like rain on tin and pressed gently, careful not to cut the spell with scorn. "Thank you for the warning," I wrote. "I'm only passing through." The ink looked too dark, as if the page were drinking. Greedily, letters formed under mine, faint and parallel, like a reflection writing back with left hand. "Stay," they suggested, but softened. "Only until the story closes." My chest tightened, not with terror, but with the ache of being asked to belong by a house that didn't know me. But what they didn't expect was how hunger works. Lonely people bargain. I offered patience as partial rent. Tonight. The page turned itself, a breath catching under paper, and there it was, tomorrow's date in a hand disturbingly like mine. It described me standing barefoot at the table, writing carefully, counting, between knocks. It added a detail I hadn't made yet. I would move the lamp 3 inches, seeking warmer light. I slid the base exactly 3 inches and felt both foolish and seen. The third knock hadn't come. It waited in the walls like a contracted muscle. I asked the book a question, a simple where. The sentence built slowly, fibers swelling with ink. In the room with the mirror. The hallway cooled, the way lakes cool, before rain. I carried the book to the spare bedroom with the tall mirror, its silver freckled like snow. My reflection wore a crease between the brows I'd never noticed. Behind it, the bedspread's pattern moved like small waves. On the dresser, a pen waited in a tumbler as if staged. I opened to the last blank page and found it already occupied. In my looped script, tomorrow's farewell was drying. I will leave the key and sweater, the window cracked because houses breathe. A final line pressed up beneath my hand. Leave this for the next. The walls listened. The third knock lifted. Open the door. Its hand to I slipped past the hallway's chill and stepped onto the deck for air that smelled of wet cedar and penny metal. The lake lay still as a held breath. The sky was crowded. Orion pinned itself above the tree line. Stars salt-shined the black. This is how you reset. Face the vast and let perspective wash you. The night obliged until it didn't. A hush rolled over the cove, a soft eraser moving upward from the horizon. Constellations winked out in succession, like a stadium losing. Power row by row. At first I blamed thin cloud, but the air stayed hard and glassy, and the temperature didn't lift. No halo, only deletions. Stars are reliable machine parts to me, chartable, loyal, yet their alphabet was being redacted. What I didn't expect was how quickly wonder curdled into dread. I inventoried explanations the way a medic reaches for labeled drawers. High aerosols could scatter differently. Invisible fog might drink starlight without glowing. Townlight could surge and drown the delicate. The brain, cornered by fatigue, could rewrite what the eyes delivered. Still, the moon remained, full, impervious, a silver coin pressed to the night. Its reflection trembled on the lake like a breathing animal. Everything else withdrew. The darkness felt engineered, as if a switch had been thrown. I leaned over the rail and found the water a better sky than the sky itself. The surface kept the moon and spared no room for stars. A perfect negative. In it I saw my silhouette, shoulders hunched, mouth aseam, breath stitching and unstitching the cold. Then the reflection moved a fraction too early, as if cued by a different conductor. My head stayed still. Down there, mine tilted. A chill went through my teeth like struck porcelain. I spoke aloud to anchor myself, voice rough as barnwood. The words broke and fell. On the lake they barely rippled and seemed to return rearranged. Same syllables, kinder cadence. I tightened my grip on the rail. Fingers squeaked against frost. The reflected hands kept their place, calm, patient. It felt like standing at a two-way mirror and realizing there are lights on both sides. But what waited behind that glass? Locals would call it a sign, a mountain omen with antlers and teeth, a sky-born warning that something on the water had asked for more than it was owed. I kept to physics because faith is a coat that fits me badly. Temperature inversions warp sound. Edge contrast can invert masks. The human face is a magician, duping its owner with every blink. Still, the lake was rehearsing me like a role, testing my timing, borrowing my breath, trying on my stance the way a child tries on a parent's coat. I steadied and chose the smaller fear, the one with numbers. I counted to 5 and lifted my left hand. The figure below lifted the right. I lowered mine. It didn't. The moon slid along the boards like a dropped coin. A line of wind combed the surface and skipped my feet entirely, as if the cold had memorized me and moved on. The reflection leaned forward, attentive. Its lips opened in a small, almost tender curve. Mine didn't move at all. In that precise, unsynced instant, the night noticed and waited. The figure below kept the smile, small as a secret sewn into a hem, and I felt the moon draw a silver seam along the railing beneath my hands. I tipped my chin the tiniest breath. The water version tilted first, courteous and wrong, like a violinist playing half a measure ahead. The lake held that grin as if it had rehearsed me for years. I inventoried again, micro-eddies, latency, in the eye, after images stacking like thin glass. But the math failed at the mouth. Bodies can pretend, timing cannot, and the timing was not mine. The darkness above me turned deliberate, a velvet dome with every pinprick stitched shut. Only, the moon remained, bright as a coin that refuses the till, and its light combed the deck, but skipped my skin as though I were a gap in the grooming. I rubbed my forearm, cold registered, but not the way cold lives on flesh. It perched instead like a moth on a window, unsure whether to enter. The reflection watched with a patience that had nothing to do with me, head cocked in gentle appraisal. But what if the mirror wasn't out there? What if it was here, and I was the glass? I tested the air the way a swimmer tests depth. One hand forward, slow, counting. My fingers cut nothing and something. The night felt viscous, like water that had learned to keep a shape. Stars should be faithful at this hour, rods firing in their quiet millions. but my vision offered only the moon and a blank. A theater lamp hung over an empty stage. I mouthed an old constellation's name to steady myself. Down on the water, my other mouth joked it, smiling like a friend who knows a story's end. A pulse climbed my throat, then echoed nowhere, a drum that had misplaced its room. I stepped to the stair of the dock. Frost squeaked under my boots with the usual pinched complaint, yet the sound seemed to travel past me, as if refusing to slow around an absence. The lake breathed once, broad, tidal, maternal, and my shoulders loosened. Despite me, the other me raised a hand in greeting, palm open, an invitation dressed as mercy. I did not move. The invitation held. I thought of the winter behind me, the months when work gnawed at sleep until the days lost edges, how I had wished to be unseen, light as smoke. Careful, the night seemed to murmur. Wishes collect interest. Physics crawled back for dignity. Temperature. Inversion can turn the sky into a lid. Scattered photons can be bullied by ground haze. The moon, indifferent, can bleach contrast until faint stars bow out. I reached into my pocket for my phone, the talisman that usually drags the world back by its collar. The screen lit my face in the bezel and not the glass. On the lake, the twin tucked the device away, still smiling, as if to say that proof is a hobby, not a rescue. Cold threaded my hair. Somewhere across the cove, a fox barked and then corrected itself, as though it too were accounting for a missing contour. I raised both hands and kept them steady. Below, the twin lowered theirs and kept the smile. The moon traveled along the plank and painted a bright shoelace near my ankle. The line should have crossed my shadow, but there was no shadow, only light continuing without negotiation. Awe and fear braided into one rope and pulled. I took a breath like a first step. The water face leaned close enough to fog the world. Between us, and for a second the deck, the house, the ridge behind it, all felt hinged to that single careful smile. Something in the night unlatched. I blinked. In the instant between open and close, the sky repopulated inside the lake. Orion reassembled in the dark mouth of water, Pleiades scattered like salt, a naive Milky Way. I looked up. Only the moon. I looked down. Stars crowded the duplicate, world, and within them my twin was not a twin at all, but a primary, unblinking, bright with purpose. It lifted a finger toward the empty air, where my constellations should have been, and then touched its own chest. A quiet claim. Understanding arrived like a tide, slow and total. The stars hadn't vanished, they had simply refused me. Or worse, I had slipped their ledger. I opened my mouth to call the sky back, and the reflection smiled wider, owning the voice I did not hear. The reflection kept my voice, and I kept my silence until the cold reached bone. I backed from the rail, hands buzzing as if I'd held a live wire, and the moon stitched itself neatly across the boards again. Inside, the air felt pressurized, like water that had forgotten it was air. I wanted heat and logic. What I found was the smell of wet stone rising from the basement door. That penny smell old houses exhale when something below them stirs. If answers wouldn't fall from the sky, maybe they sat in the dark. I took a flashlight and counted each step under my breath. The basement was a low stone bowl, mortar weeping dusty shelves. My beam found a coal scuttle, canning jars with rubber gaskets gone brittle, and a blue marble bottle stopped like a caught throat. Beneath the workbench, spiderweb constellations, fragile as frost. I told myself this was a light archaeology of layers. But what I didn't expect was the breeze with no source, cool and sourceless, arriving in pulses like a sleeper's breath. The draft ended behind the rusting oil tank. I should have left it, called the owner. Curiosity is a locksmith. I leaned a shoulder into the tank and shoved it, metal side. Behind it, a rectangular seam in the flagstone, a flush trap door, the iron ring nearly gone. I gripped the ring, the cold bit like a coin between teeth. The panel rose, revealing steps. The treads were scuffed, a path generations mark without meeting. I descended and the acoustics shifted to chapel. My breath returned, soft as a hand. The chamber opened, braced with cedar posts. Tables stood in rows, each altar-like, buttons gone green, a locket with ash-colored hair, a motel key fob, a stopped plastic watch, a receipt for bread and twine. Memory had been arranged by hands that disagreed on century. Tender order felt like bait. Then the walls explained themselves. Carvings ran shoulder to shoulder, fine as print. At first I read stars, clusters and arcs, but the proportions were wrong for sky. The pattern curved not above but around, as if mapping a basin. Lines threaded from knot to knot like creeks feeding a lake. When I traced one arc with a fingertip, the rock felt faintly warm, as if it held a worn prayer. In the locket's oval glass, the cuts multiplied, a swarm of fireflies letting the pattern teach its grammar. A larger sigil recurred, 3 short slashes and 1 long. At the chamber's center, a single mark sat alone, gouged deeper than the rest and ringed with pockmarks. A small wooden stake lay beside it, tip charred. The air thickened, velvet turned against the nap. The flashlight flickered, though the batteries were new. The proportions matched the cove. The center mark sat exactly where the house would sit on such a map. A drip ticked behind me, patient as a metronome. Above, wood rasped, as if a hatch were deciding whether to fall. The carving seemed to flex, the basin breathing. If the map was faithful, I wasn't near the mark. I was on it. The drip answered with a second note, closer, round as a mouth. I turned toward the stairs to test my exit, and the room tilted, polite as a host with a guiding hand at my elbow. For now, stairs first, I told myself, because exits are oxygen. I climbed 2 steps and felt the hatch above shift, wood on wood like teeth testing a bite. The room breathed behind me, a sleeper sensing I had left the bed. My light swept the tables, and each object brightened, as if oiled by attention. Folks whisper about rooms older than deeds, hush houses under houses, places that keep a town like a ledger. I had opened the ledger. I moved to the table and began a log, because naming is how panic is tamed. A brass button green as pond skin, a child's marble cloudy as breath, the locket with ash hair tied like a river. Artifacts behave like memory, I thought. They cluster, they confirm. But the order here felt too curated, as if a single mind had shelved centuries. The carvings seemed to ripple in the bottle's curve, constellations bending like reeds in water. I remembered a lecture about place memory, how architecture can recall the way a scent unlocks a door. Rooms train stories to repeat. Folklore says the mountain keeps what you tell it, and returns it with interest. The chamber agreed, adjusting its pitch as I moved, like a cello following a hand. Nails ticked inside timbers, and metronomic. But what if it was not recalling others, but training me? My steps began to land where dust parted. I set the flashlight on the floor and measured with my eyes, a surveyor without tools. The arcs matched the cove, the slashes matched feeder creeks. The deep gouge sat where the foundation would pierce a lake. The stake looked like a survey pin that had learned fire. I paced from mark to wall and hit the piers. The sound traveled along a hidden ring. If this was a map, what was the legend, and who needed directions? The floor tilted, not a lurch, but persuasion, gravity, a host steering me. The drip became 2, then 3, a dotted rhythm from below. Elders at the store call it witch water, a spring that finds a house like a hound. I named it hydrostatic pressure, a thirsty aquifer lifting its shoulder. The air tasted of batteries. The carvings brightened in patches, like fireflies agreeing on a pattern. But patterns plan. Who was this one planning for tonight? Water printed itself through the floor in dark coins, then linked into threads. A marble rolled and circled as if relearning tide. I went for the stairs and the hatch settled, inch by inch, its weight a sentence. I set my shoulder and pushed. The wood refused like an animal. The flashlight hiccuped, then held. I thought of guests who signed a name upstairs and left pieces here, permanent. If a room collects us, then tonight it was counting me. Water spoke clearer. It welled through the center mark and crept toward my boots, cold as a coin. The carvings lit with a shine, lines connecting like veins under skin, drawing roots across the basin to this point. Memory theory says repetition deepens grooves. Folklore says a path walked enough becomes will. I backed to the tables, lifted the locket, felt the hair like river grass. The hatch gave one sigh and sealed. The room began to fill, steady, certain. Water. Climbed my shins the way a rumor climbs a town. Quiet at first, then in every room at once. The hatch above sealed with a tired sigh, and the hidden chamber took its new assignment, to become a well. Tables lightened as their offerings learned to float. The brass button spun like a planet. The marble rolled its one blue eye. The locket in my fist drank cold. I braced against a cedar post while the carvings on the walls brightened, lines slick with shine, a basin remembering itself like a fading lantern relit. I heard his voice as if the water carried it through its bones. The old man at the store, the one with the river map hands, had said the lake remembers everything dropped into it. Objects, prayers, lies, keeps them filed like a courthouse basement. I'd smiled then, the courteous disbelief of someone who prefers answers with footnotes. Memory in water was a fringe idea I'd read, flamboyant as a sideshow, useful mostly as metaphor. Yet down here the metaphor wore boots. The room felt like a clerk standing, reaching for my folder. Evidence first, I told myself, because fear edits. The current could have stolen from the main basement. The spring under the house might dredge what the lake coughed up. But then a red plastic whistle bobbed through a gap between stones and tapped my knee. Sun faded at the mouth, tooth marks on the stem. I knew its scar like a signature. I lost that whistle in a city gutter 2 states away when I was 9. Behind it drifted a water-warped library card carrying my childhood name in my mother's looping hand, letters softened to river stones. The lake had no map to that life, unless the map was me, cold braided higher. The chamber's air turned metallic, the taste of a bitten tongue. On the water's skin, bubbles arranged themselves into rows like beads, then broke, Morse with a stutter. Hypoxia can paint hallucinations. Stress invites echoes. The brain is a jukebox that plays what you're afraid to dance to. Still, the artifacts kept arriving, each more unreasonable than the last. A bent house key from an apartment I'd left a decade ago. A Polaroid where my brother and I squinted into July. A subway token gone green as pond skin. I hadn't brought any of it. The room curated my past with the calm of a museum that knows the donor. The carvings flickered, and for a breath the groove map lifted. A relief map under rain. Creeks, bright as veins feeding a single throat. Standing there, I felt the ache the mountain carries for its lost. That communal bruise folklore keeps poking so it does not go numb. The lake, if it was mined, wasn't gentle, but it wasn't cruel either. It was thorough. It returned what we drop when we're busy becoming someone else. But what it didn't expect was the way grief fights back, even when delivered with receipts. My mouth filled with the old copper taste of a name I don't say. The water reached my thighs and steadied as if choosing the height at which talk becomes unavoidable. A tremor ran through the cedar posts, tiny as a pulse under jaw. I lifted the locket and it clicked, a perfect tooth on gear. Inside lay hair the color of riverweed and a scrap of paper scalloped by time. The ink had wandered, but the letters held, remember. I looked down, and the surface gathered itself into glass. Not my face, not yet. Someone's porch at dusk leaned toward me from the water, wind chimes stilled. A woman's sleeve sliding into the frame like a promise I had never made. The porch sharpened as if the lake turned a dimmer, and cold stepped out of the water and into me. A hall opened. A man crossed carrying a paper sack, shoulders set in the angle I had learned from loss. He looked through me and called a name I hadn't said in years. If the lake remembered him, was it asking me to remember what I kept shelving? The image, dissolved into a road at night, headlights swimming, rain stitching the windshield like needles in a pinned map. Laughter from the passenger seat folded into air, a scream misfiled as wind. I let the reel run, hospital light like dishwater, a phone hot against my ear, the bureaucracy of mercy. We drop more than keys, I thought. We drop whole versions of ourselves and pretend the river didn't keep receipts. Artifacts orbited my knees, bottle caps, a cracked friendship bracelet, a motel matchbook furred with mildew, my brother's copper penny lucky until it wasn't. The carvings pulsed, lantern slow. I tried to audit the impossible like a farmer checking fences at dusk. Water can store patterns, rooms train minds, attention imprints. Yet this felt curated, not accidental. But what if the miracle wasn't magic, only witness? The mountain becoming archive, the lake binding pages no courthouse ever would. A small wave delivered the Polaroid to my hand. Our faces were sunlit, eyes squinting into futures naive enough to believe us. I held it at the same angle the water held the vision, and for one held note, porch and road and paper braided. My chest cracked like thawing ice. Had I left or been carried? If this ledger balanced, where ended intention and began current? The room waited, patient as a teacher with a hand on the brake. I spoke to the water as if it were a person doing its best. I said I was done treating grief like a private exam. I admitted to the buoyancy that followed the worst weeks, that shame-bright lightness grief polices. The water rose to my waist and warmed a breath, not comfort so much as calibration. A surface can touch like a cool hand on a fevered brow and still be measuring the not mine. Men in canvas coats, a girl with a ribbon, a ranger's badge filmed with silt, a lunchbox lidded with rust. Storms without names, hands gripping rails that failed, boots trusting planks that lied. The lake widened its lens until a choir fit inside. I felt the town's bruise bloom, collective, old as rainfall. But what it didn't expect was the answer rising in me. I would stand witness back. I would hold what it handed without blinking. I lifted the locket. The hair inside wavered like river grass in a current that wasn't there. Remember, the paper insisted. The surface lacquered, inviting my face. I forced myself to meet it. Eyes met eyes, and a life arranged behind them like shelves. Not mine. A kitchen I'd never cooked in, a dog that knew my whistle, a calendar scored through a year I hadn't lived. My name pinned to a bill by a trout magnet. I blinked, and the stranger didn't. My reflection held someone else's memories, not mine, and waited to see which name I chose now. My reflection held someone else's memories and waited for me to choose a name. I could taste copper at the back of my tongue, the locket heavy as a verdict in my palm. The water no longer showed a face so much as a ledger, pages turning themselves. I whispered my own name once, and the image resisted. I spoke the lost one, and the surface softened like wax near a flame. Choice, I understood, was the hinge the lake had been oiling all along. If I kept refusing, it would keep rehearsing me forever. The house and the water breathed together, a matched pair of lungs. A ribbed lantern stirred under the boards. The windows filmed and wrote one polite word: stay. From the cove, my almost voice counted sevens. The dock remembered the letter it had learned. Somewhere the ice rang its thin bell. Upstairs, the guest book warmed. Beneath my feet, the hidden rooms. Map lifted its veins. This wasn't a collage of hauntings. It was choreography. I reached for the toolbox of reason because that is how I was built. Infrasound can open a door in the gut. A seiche can move water without moving surface. Predictive brains draw faces in noise. Place memory trains behavior like a path cut through tall grass. Yet the pattern exceeded the parts, the way a murmuration exceeds wings. Occam's razor stopped shaving and pointed. The basin wasn't a container. It was a network, a mind of watershed and timber, archive and appetite, coded like a forgotten map. Guilt had fed it. Curiosity had fed it more. I had been both hunter and lamb, chasing the source while seasoning myself. If cycles are engines, someone has to throw the switch. I thought of the whistle, the Polaroid, the names I wouldn't say. Ending this would require the one thing I had withheld: surrender without bargain, not drowning by accident, descent by consent. But what would it expect if I stepped first? The hatch above the chamber lifted an inch, as if answering the thought. Water fell back, stair by stair, in courteous increments. I carried the locket and the red whistle up into the pressurized dark, past shelves that waited like witnesses. The house received me with the hush after a vow. I left the guest book open on the table and wrote a single line for the next pair of hands. I am going to return what it kept. The ink bled quickly, as if the paper had been thirsty for the sentence. Outside, the cove held its black porcelain. The moon stood coin still. At the dock, the fourth plank hummed its cello note. Below, a milky jar lantern brightened, taking position beneath the iron ring. The water's skin thickened like cloth ready to bear weight. My almost voice rose from the fog and stopped, waiting for me to choose my own count. I took off my boots, set the whistle on the post, and felt the boards cool under bare feet. 5 breaths. The windows watched without fogging. 4. The jar steadied beneath me like an opened eye. 3. Letters on the water began to gather. 2. I looked straight ahead and decided. 1. I stepped past the third plank, leaned into the seam, and let the lake take my name in its mouth. The water accepted me without a splash, a mouth closing around a coin. Cold cinched me, and the jar lantern drifted beneath like a slow pupil, keeping me centered. The surface sealed above, fabric drawn over a frame, and sound changed register. Planks became bass, ribs kept time. This was not drowning yet. It was cataloging. I counted beats between pulses the way a diver counts light and let the lake thread me through cloth. A baptism paired with autopsy. My name softened on the water's tongue, then dissolved into current like salt. Pressure stacked. Voices braided to a cord around me. The dock's cello hum, the thin bell of winter ice, the breathy consonants the windows wrote, the counting echo from Blackwater's fog. The chamber's carved map returned as sensation, veins flowing from shore to mind, feeder creeks resolving into sentences. I tried to name each instrument to stay human. Naming steadies the hand like a surgeon whispering bones. But what I didn't expect was how quickly the catalog began naming me. The basin behaved like a question with recall, testing where I would break and yield. Light learned me. Points awakened in the dark, not stars but motes, a plankton alphabet. They circled, then aligned, tracing constellations never overhead. The unfinished dock, the trapdoor ring, the iron nail I worried during storms. The basin spelled itself across my sternum. I kept my mouth closed, but the lake tasted my story through skin. Salt, fear, loss, information dissolving like sugar in tea. Science persisted, stubborn as a lantern in rain. Bioluminescence, chemotaxis, imagined order. Yet order assembled, me instead, coding muscle and memory into a map drafted for years. The bottom rose as a slow translation. Silt parted to reveal the hidden room from below, cedar posts rooted like cypress knees. Artifacts lifted in patient orbits, the marble, the token, the button, and drifted toward me as if confirming inventory. I opened my fist. The locket floated and revolved, hair inside streaming like river grass. The red whistle spun, impatient, a planet asking release. I let both go. They found a current, paused, and dove through the trapdoor's ghost, returning to their shelf. The ledger, satisfied, turned its next page in the dark. Shapes gathered, not hands but memories with edges. A ranger's badge flared. A girl's ribbon wrote a red line in the dim. A lantern jar pulsed like a heartbeat saying, "Proceed." Grief loosened under my ribs, reluctant but real, a knot warmed between palms. I felt the town's bruise open and breathe around me, a school of hurts moving as one mind. I told the water I would stop negotiating with what it already knew. If the cycle needed consent, it had mine. Not surrender to hunger, but an offering to end rehearsal. The lake accepted the answer. It drew me deeper, then pivoted me, aligning spine to channel, midwife sure. My last air softened. When it left, water entered like anesthesia. Pain narrowed to a hinge. Quiet widened to a room. I did not vanish. I was repurposed, unspooled from a single signature and threaded into a net waiting for one more strand. Above, the dock exhaled, the windows cleared. On the surface, the lake went still. One thing moved. A ripple wrote my name, then smoothed, saving the rest for whoever comes next. Subscribe if you dare.